I'm just always fascinated when I'm in groups of people, like even at the McDonald's, and watching how people are engaging. You can tell when someone's having a bad day, even as they're ordering their Big Mac. And that becomes interesting to me.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Charles O. Anderson is the fourth Artist Laureate at The Ohio State University. He is Professor of Dance and Artistic Director of the Charles O. Anderson Dance Theater X, an Afro Contemporary Dance Theater Company, which he founded in Philadelphia in 2003. Professor Anderson, congratulations and welcome to Voices.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So you describe yourself as a kinetic storyteller, and I'd like you to begin by, first of all, telling us what you mean by kinetic storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm a choreographer and I feel choreographers can tell a story. I arrived upon the idea of kinetic storyteller because it's about understanding movement itself as a mode of knowledge production and memory transmission and meaning making. So dance theater felt too, for lack of better words, colonized. And kinetic storytelling sort of speaks to my sort of cultural upbringing, how I came into dance through the Black church and through New York City clubs. I'm really interested in how bodies remember and how histories are carried somatically and how communities transmit values through embodied practice, meaning, line dances, rodeos. I'm really interested in gesture, rhythm, spatial relationships, meaning how we stand in proximity to each other and the physical action that reveals contradictions and desires and truths that spoken language can't do by itself. So that's why kinetic feels more accurate than kinesthetic for me.
You say you're interested in how bodies remember. Would you say a little more about that very interesting idea?
I think that's definitely coming from my lived experience as a Black queer man in the United States. More importantly, it's the idea of how we sometimes don't realize we're sort of fish in fish bowls, in the sense of we carry knowledge and practices and ways of being that we don't necessarily automatically learn in school, but they are so deeply embedded, they just feel like a part of our cultural DNA. And I always find it interesting when we have moments where we realize that that is something that is through nurture and not nature. And so that's what I mean by carrying histories, that those histories are nurtured through how we move through the world and the interactions and the phenomena that we encounter as we keep breathing on this planet.
And you describe movement as a mode of knowledge. And I'd like to excavate that a little further, because obviously I interview lots of people on this podcast. We talk about knowledge, scientific knowledge, for instance. How is movement a mode of knowledge?
My mom asked me this question, and it was easier to explain it not through dance, but when we don't move, when we choose not to move, that is movement. It's my first experiences going to dance concerts as a younger person. I thought you could react like, oh, wow, like you can at the circus. And I learned that that is frowned upon. And so my embodied experience of the performance became profoundly different when I started to realize the tension that was being carried in my own body. Being in academia, in faculty meetings, my favorite thing, watching the ways in which we hold ourselves and how we release energy if we are prone to do so. I think I'm just always fascinated when I'm in groups of people, like even at the McDonald's, and watching how people are engaging. You can tell when someone's having a bad day, even as they're ordering their Big Mac. And that becomes interesting to me.
You talked about the tension in your own body. Is that a source of ideas for dances you've choreographed?
Yeah, I'm always interested in the sort of somatic meta narrative, and that's a lot of jargon, but I have social anxiety. So I think a lot about the notion of going into a crowd in my body's always bracing rather than just being present. And so over my adulthood, I've had to practice ways to be present and not automatically be in a fight or flight state. And so in doing that and observing how other people do that, I started to really recognize that tension is also a useful thing, meaning tension creates that restraint for civility, quote unquote, or for when you feel endangered, like animals in the wild, like try to make yourself larger than you are to hope to avoid attack. I find those things really compelling in performance as a way to get beyond like steps and counts, but to the lived experience, dance theater aspect of concert dance.
You founded Dance Theater X in Philadelphia and describe it as an Afro contemporary dance theater company. What does Afro contemporary mean for you?
I arrived through two of my mentors who are really pioneers in sort of Black dance studies, Carrieamu Welsh, or formerly Carrieamu Welsh Asante, and Brenda Dixon Gottschall, who are both pillars in dance scholarship. I arrived at that because I have never considered myself a practitioner of quote unquote traditional African dance, which I already find to be a problematic statement, meaning I think African dance in and of itself is always in the now, and there are certain things that we practice to stay rooted to those origins. So Afro contemporary was a way for me to embrace my own identity. I started dance in ballet and Cunningham technique, not in any sort of African form.
Like
Being
Merce Cunningham, you mean?
first
Yes.
Cunningham, yes, which all was very strange in my body, but that was what was considered legible and legitimate dance. And so it took me years to realize that what I used to be doing in Black churches in Virginia is dance as well. And then what I was doing in nightclubs is dance as well. So Afro contemporary became an opportunity to be in an experimental state without using the term experimental dance, which also carries its own meanings.
One of your major works is called Recurrent Unrest. And first of all, and I understand this is an audio medium and we're talking about something that's very kinesthetic and kinetic and visual. First of all, could you describe that dance for us, Recurrent Unrest?
Yeah, recurrent unrest is in a lot of ways, it came out of my pedagogy at UT Austin. It was around the time where the Black Lives Matter movement was starting to take hold after Trayvon Martin. And it became this opportunity to help my students learn something about how the arts can actually evoke and create space for difficult conversations without words. So, how can we grapple with things? I put in simple terms, a lot of students wanted to organize and protest, but it's not really something that they know how to do, and the stakes scared them. So we started to imagine, well, how do we do that perhaps on the stage in a way that we realize we are contributing to the conversation in a way that allows us, it's basically a laboratory for thinking about larger civil engagement. And also, as again at Cornell, I was introduced to Steve Reich, who also was a Cornell alum, and his music has always haunted me. It was introduced to me as a way to elevate my musical style, to just use the terminology. And of course, I resonated with his early works using a lot of African American voices, particularly Come Out, which I think was one of his most seminal early works, and the history behind that. And so this project manifested itself into this sort of kinesthetic, well, bluntly, kinetic storytelling of civil unrest, particularly in Black and marginalized bodies, thinking without trying to be linear, but thinking about it from an African context of polycentrism and polyrhythm. And Steve Reich's music served as the foundation for that. Because of the intense repetition, it gives you that opportunity to see things unfold. And so that's what happened in the work.
So Steve Reich is famous, of course, for being a minimalist composer. So is this work Also sort of minimalist and repetitive. Is that the idea?
Well, actually, it's a cultural intervention in the sense of his work is minimalist, except when you listen to the entirety of it, you see from that simplicity how multi-layered it is. So I approach that from an Africanist standpoint of thinking about the idea of accumulation or repetition as deepening and intensification. And so the work itself is not minimalist in any way, but it's definitely cumulative in constant conversation with some of those cultural references that informed his work. And I say that with deep respect for him in terms of he innovated a way of composing what always, and I don't think that's his doing, but oftentimes the cultural context through which that work manifested gets erased in the celebration of his sort of technical acumen. So again, Come Out is based on the young men who were falsely incarcerated. And the voice we hear in that is Daniel Ham
Mhm.
describing the interrogation process. The work itself does that beautiful thing of taking us out of that context into these other ways of imagining come out to show them, come out to show them. But what always sat with me is that we forget the very real experience that produced that language that allowed Steve Reich to find this way to work.
So recurrent unrest starts with an idea. It comes out of a particular sort of social moment, I guess. How do you sort of turn that then into a dance? In other words, is this something that you are seeing in your mind's eye? Is this something that you're seeing in your imagination? Is this something that you actually sort of move yourself to? I'm trying to understand how a choreographer works, I guess.
Well, I mean, you're going to get a different answer every time. I would say for me, it's why I call it dance theater. I tend to think in a narrative context, meaning there's a why before I even think about how. Like, why do I want to do what I'm doing? And in this particular case, for me, it's about Ta-Nehisi Coates' book and James Baldwin's Fire Next Time were sort of the guiding light for me, meaning this was a transmission of a lived experience of someone from Generation X to millennials and Generation Y. And so with that, it allowed me to think about the social dances of the time. So the students, of course, are quite fluent in those. And most of the times, those have connections to earlier historical versions of those dances. So a lot of this came out of using movement in pop culture to explain the larger sociopolitical ramifications. We used an abstraction of an image of, I think it's Kylie or Kendall Jenner holding a Pepsi can in a protest. And I use that juxtaposed with this African American woman from the civil rights movement who's just standing there in defiance as police are there too.
Right.
And that's all we had to do. We don't have to explain any of that. And so then the movement comes out of thinking about those particular contexts, meaning the embodiment of being in a protest, how the bodies move through the streets, thinking about civil unrest and how bodies engage with authority in those contexts, thinking about intimacy between marginalized bodies of different experiences. And the backdrop is Steve Reich. So that beautiful simplicity allows for all of that complexity to manifest without feeling like you have to understand everything, but you literally, to put it bluntly, Recurrent Unrest is about staying awake. I wanted to say woke, but we know that's a bad word now. So yeah.
So recurrent unrest has a reparations initiative attached to it. Could you explain what a reparations initiative is?
Yeah, that was my idea of making sure the concert dance has, even if, when we talk about Black concert dance, there's a demographic that comes to theaters and there's demographics who don't think they belong in those spaces.
Mhm.
And sometimes that's due to cost or to affordability to even get there. So the initial idea of this piece is that wherever it was toured, there's also a subsidy set aside to invite members of the community whose lived experiences might actually intersect with this. So it's not solely just Black people thinking about elders who lived through the civil rights of all races to experience this sort of contemporary idea, thinking about dancers who didn't realize that dance could do this because they are being taught in rural communities where they don't have access to a lot of things. So money was always intended to be set aside to transport them there, to make them feel welcome, and to engage them with the work. Mind you, Recurrent Unrest never really had that life because the pandemic hit, so it became a
Uh,
dance. So, so the dance film actually pivoting became the new word, and it actually reached far more people that way than I think the physical tour would have. And I still, through the power of Zoom, was able to engage with a lot of those communities. And I still have a lot of conversations with people who saw the work now 6 years ago. So, yeah.
how do you think about the relationship between art and social change?
Yeah, I'm a child of Nina Simone. I guess in the sense of I think it's the artist's duty to reflect the times. And mind you, I didn't start dancing until I was 19. So I was a little more fully formed than a lot of dancers, meaning I wasn't raised in the rigors of purely technical acumen. I came into it because I found a way to have a voice that set me free. And so I was stubborn in my training in the sense of I needed to know why we were doing the things we were doing, even as I was learning those techniques. And that ended up informing my choreographic strategy as well.
Hmm. What are your plans for your year as artist laureate?
I'm building this project called Croatoa, Re-Singing the America's Next 250 Years. As we know, we're celebrating that anniversary. And so I became really interested in how many of us aren't just looking back, but looking forward. What are we going to celebrate at 500 years? How can we author a celebration or a reflection that builds and learns from these past 250 years to not repeat the exact same thing again? So the idea of this is to tour throughout Ohio because Ohio is such a unique state in and of itself. I'm engaging in some activities that are body based, but not for dancers per se, to kind of what we've been talking to this conversation, to be in community together, to recognize that we are US. So I get really caught up in like US is us. So how do we reimagine a new us for the next 250 years? And that serves as the premise of a lot of what I'll be doing with some of the regional campuses in Ohio State, as well as some of our partner sister universities in the state, as well as beyond with Dayton Contemporary, because all of this is also serving as sort of dramaturgical research for community engagement as Dayton Contemporary takes the larger project of Re-Singing from the Underspace and begins touring it in 2027.
So, what sorts of things will you be doing with folks around the state? You say who are not dancers.
Yeah, well, I say it that way to make sure that no one feels like, oh, I can't be involved in it. So there are three core activities that are being offered depending on the partner institution we're working with. One is, for lack of better words, I call it community testimony, where I'm developing a series of questions that people can respond to and will start to reveal our unique histories and relationships to this notion of belonging in this context. In just those conversations unfolding, like there's no intention to make it into anything, but just to literally point out we're sharing a space, and that in and of itself is the project of this country. It's what makes this nation so unique. We are united over an ideology, not really blood per se in a lot of ways. The other part, the manifestation, if you will, is the notion of something called a wailing wall, which is without dictating to people what that is, letting the community decide what is the artifact that sort of encaptures what we did. And that can be post-it notes that are on a whiteboard if you want. It can be much more artistically complex, but it is populated by the perspectives, the ideas of participants through the project, as well as people that they engage. And it stays beyond our limited engagement with them. And my hope is to be able to collect some of those wailing walls to make them a part of the scenic design for the larger Dayton Contemporary project, so that as it keeps touring, it becomes a much more dense sort of visual scenic element throughout. And then the last part is engaging those who are interested to be in performance with Dayton Contemporary as they tour. Similar to Recurrent Unrest, the work isn't just about the most trained bodies, it's about the bodies that feel the stakes of the work. So I'm thinking very much again of my mother. Like, how could I have my mother on stage at 78 years old, knowing she's not going to do a high kick, but her presence brings a gravitas to the piece that dancers alone could not?
Maybe I begged this question earlier, but what do you think keeps some people intimidated by dance?
Oh, we don't have enough time for that one. I think again, it's the sort of cultural narrative around what we call dance. And I'm saying that knowing the how hard it is to become a professional dancer, but we all dance. And no, we don't all necessarily have to get paid to do it. But I think our society makes us afraid of our bodies. And I'm trying not to be too inflammatory, but I think we become a little concerned about what we look like, not realizing that our bodies aren't just reflectors. So when we work through that, we actually have a more authentic interaction and connection with people and can live in truth rather than in the performance of certain ways of being that, again, are things we inherit more than sometimes we actually hold core to ourselves. Or put another way, I think people tend to fear dance, not realizing it literally was the first art form. It's the thing we did before anything else. And so it's probably the most accessible of a lot of the other performing arts. But So You Think You Can Dance and various other things have made us believe that none of us are capable of dancing, which is tragic to me. It's almost what kept me out of it. I couldn't even imagine I could do this until 19 when I was in college.
Well, and I want to ask you about that, but I didn't want to let it pass. Why is your program called Croatoa? What does that mean? Where does that come from?
Well, yeah, I mean, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia in the 1970s, so it's a very specific time. And one of the field trips that was almost annual for me was going to Jamestown. And I had a teacher in around fifth or sixth grade who just offhandedly said, well, this isn't the first colony. She ended up explaining the first colony at Roanoke Island. And of course, that almost like the campfire story of like, and they disappeared. And on a tree was carved the words Croatoa. That's always sat with me because I couldn't help but imagine, because I'm a comic book and sci-fi geek, that what if they actually continued to evolve and build a cultural identity alongside what we call the United States? And so it
Hmm.
became this really fertile way to invite people to imagine the next 250 years without imposing anything on them. So we don't have to think about the US. Let's talk about living in Croatoa. Let's talk about the first engagements with indigenous people. So let's talk about the idea that maybe rather than crystallizing, this became sort of like an expansion. And so Croatoa has been informing us this whole time. So what can we do with that information?
And you've said now on a couple of occasions that you were 19 when you first started taking dance seriously. So you didn't know you were going to be a dancer at age 4. So why dance? Why did you end up in dance as opposed to physics or playing rugby or something like that? Why dance?
I was a first gen college student. I went to an Ivy League school and didn't even really know what that meant, but it felt good. And so I started in mechanical engineering because I was good at physics and math. My first year roommate, his girlfriend was a dance major, and we hit it off. And she literally got me up to start moving. And she was like, you should take a dance class. And I did, and went to a performance by a company called the Urban Bushwomen, Jale Willa Joe Zoller, who is one of my heroes. And I didn't even realize it was possible for that type of work to exist. And once I saw it, I naively just decided I was going to make a dance. The privilege of being a male in dance, the dance professors noticed and they encouraged me to take more classes. And unbeknownst to my family, I switched majors and here we are.
What was that conversation like? I'm not going to be an engineer. I'm going to be a choreographer, a dancer.
We still talk about it more than 30 something years. But yeah, actually, that's what I mean by the first gen part, in the sense of my family wanted to make sure that this was an investment that I could take care of myself. And so the arts did not seem viable. But ironically, the first 3 years in engineering made it viable. So I moved to New York and became an assistant schools principal to supplement my income to keep dancing and training. So yeah.
You've performed with some legendary choreographers over your career, Ronald K. Brown, Sean Curran, Mark Dendy. What's the most important thing you learned from being a dancer in someone else's company before stepping into the role of artistic director for your own company?
I think for me, because of when I started, I approached it still very much like a student. I was just absorbing. And Ronald K. Brown, particularly, I met him actually socially at a club before I met him in a studio. And it was all of those choreographers, I ended up engaging with them more as people than as choreographers. And so when I came into their creative spaces, I was so intent on taking care of their work, meaning they had points of view and visions, and I understood immediately my responsibility is to honor and to lift that up. And it's somewhat, I think, how I ended up becoming successful without as much training as a lot of my peers, because I always was intellectually engaging with their work, not solely trying to find the shapes and the steps, but why are we doing that? And it's also why it evolved into a choreographer, because the more I was exposed to that, the hungrier I became to just practice in that space, as opposed to serving purely as a vessel for something that I may or may not fully even understand what I'm a part of, which is oftentimes the case with dancers. It's very similar to soldiers. You get your orders, you go, and the ramifications of that, maybe you'll find out later. So I needed to sort of be a general.
As you've mentioned, you grew up in Richmond, Virginia. You studied at Cornell. You've built your career in places like Philadelphia and Texas, now in Columbus. How have all those places shaped you as an artist?
Yeah, of course, like every other, especially for my generation, I was in New York for 6 years, and because that's what you're supposed to do. And I loved that. And of course, it gave me the sort of pedigree to make these other places take notice of me in some regards. I think Philadelphia is where I came into my choreographic self. That's where I went to graduate school at Temple University and met those mentors. And the funding at that time was so amazing that an emerging choreographer could actually get the money to build these ambitious projects that I was interested in. And it's ironically how I also entered into academia, because what I was doing was interesting enough that I was recruited to become a professor at a small liberal arts college called Muhlenberg College outside of Philadelphia. And it was in those spaces that I really started to understand that I love what dance does to the community, meaning not the performance itself, but the effect of performances. So it became how I approached my work, like to create the opportunity for bearing witness and for testimony to manifest through watching and then through reflecting on what you saw, and then keep coming back to that, even if the performance is no longer in your face, if you will. And then I moved to Texas, particularly because it was Texas, in the sense of it felt like ground zero for engaging with some of the themes that I'm interested in. The notion of liberatory aesthetics, I felt like that's a great testing ground for those ideas of making work that is for letting people find their own creative freedom and opportunity to belong. And ironically, Columbus has always fascinated me because it is one of those interesting states that, after what I call the heyday of Virginia, a lot of folks found themselves moving in this direction to change those histories that their bodies are carrying and to try to slough it off a little bit. So it's been interesting to live here the past few years and see how that has played itself out. And yeah, I'll just leave it at it's been interesting.
Tell us what's next for your work.
I am in the middle of developing a new dance theater project called Re-Singing From the Underspace with Dayton Contemporary Dance Company that is thinking about Shakespeare's The Tempest, or more specifically, Prospero's speeches from Shakespeare's The Tempest, is a way of thinking about those characters that don't have those opportunities to speak, such as Ariel Caliban in the mythical Sycorax. So the Re-Singing from the Underspace is intended to sort of take us back to that island slash Croatoa to see what's been going on with them over the past few years.
Charles O. Anderson, thank you.
Thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at The Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.